Hi, everybody. Welcome to our joint CCA IRP meeting webinar conversation. So today we're trying to give you a bit of a background on what it is that we are hoping to accomplish. We'd like to go over our approach to modeling and analysis assumptions and get some of your feedback and questions as we go through. So we are hoping to structure this more as a conversation. We will be presenting, but if you have a comment to make or a question to make along the way, you're encouraged to do so. And you can either do that by unmuting your line and going ahead and asking, or you can also use the Zoom group chat, which we'll be monitoring, so we'll be able to respond that way as well. Okay. So this first slide is really going through the background of what brings us here today. As many of you are well aware, the California law requires all load-serving entities to prepare integrated resource plans. And so each CCA, as well as every investor-owned utility and energy service provider, is required to file an IRP with the PUC on a biennial basis. It's a 2-year cycle. Through the IRP process at the Commission. In the first year, the PUC develops their reference system portfolio, and that's used in the CAISO transmission planning process and in the LSC's IRPs. And then in the second year of the cycle, we file our IRPs at the PUC. They take that data, they aggregate it, they evaluate it, and they use that to form their recommended preferred system portfolio. So right now, the first IRP was due back in 2018, and we are gearing up for the next IRP filing by LSCs, which is due May 1, 2020. So the reason that we decided to work on this process jointly is because we had some lessons learned from last time around. First of all, IRPs are developed by individual LSCs, which means they end up being somewhat individualized plans, but without this understanding of the collective impact of the plans. This is something that, in theory, the PUC's aggregation process would kind of help us solve for, but the process has actually been fairly messy to date, and what we have found is just without that common understanding of our goals and of being able to optimize to a broader portfolio, it can be a real challenge to present an individual plan that fits in well to the collective. And so we've undertaken this effort to try to plan jointly so that we can really understand in better detail earlier on in the process where we might, for example, be relying on the same resources or where we might have shortfalls so that we can better optimize and avoid a situation where when you take all the different IRPs, they don't really roll up to a collective whole. So we're also hoping through this process it may highlight some opportunities for us to consider future joint procurement. And we're also hoping as well that we're going to be getting information from this process that might help supplement the information that the PUC is developing on their own. Happy to share the information and make this a better process. So I should note that we have 4 CCAs that are participating in this joint CCA effort. It's the Clean Power Alliance, East Bay Community Energy, Peninsula Clean Energy, and San Jose Clean Energy. And we are working with Siemens, who's also on the line. They are our contractor that is helping us to conduct the technical modeling. So, we're offering you this presentation, but we also have Siemens folks on the phone that can help answer any technical questions that you might have about their modeling. So what are our goals for this IRP? We came up with 7, and I'll just go through those real quick. One is kind of the probably most obvious goal for any IRP, which is to identify the cost-effective, feasible, reliable, equitable, and robust options to achieve our respective communities' goals and objectives and to minimize carbon emissions. One of the reasons that most CCAs exist is to help minimize the state's carbon emissions. It's one of the public interest reasons that our communities chose to found a CCA, and so it's a key component as we go through planning our IRP. We also want to inform and engage stakeholders in the IRP process. So we recognize that there are a lot of thought leaders and folks with perspectives to add outside of our own agencies. And so one of our efforts is to make sure that we're really reaching outside of our own agencies as we go through this process. One of the goals is to allow this process to inform the selection of our preferred portfolio. So, we're going to be doing modeling, we're going to be getting some results, some preliminary results, we're going to have some choices to make, and then we're going to use that process to really inform our future plans. We're also wanting to use one model for consistency and optimization, simulated dispatch, and probabilistic functions. We think this provides for a better result, a more realistic result, and particularly a more optimal result. We want to test a range of portfolios in scenario modeling and ultimately in risk analysis. Of course, we want to meet and comply with the CPUC requirements. And we need to do all of this in a timely enough manner to make sure that we have our board and council approvals in advance of the filing deadline. Any questions at this stage before we continue on? I'm actually going to turn the presentation over to Doug. He's going to cover the next couple of slides.
Yeah, so I think, thanks again for participating and hopefully provide us comments either today or going forward. So I think one of the key things that we're going to be moving into now is to get a handle on how this process is going to work. And one of the key things, of course, that we need to be able to do is to, at a base is to evaluate our current energy resource portfolio and develop a range of future alternative portfolios to meet the loads that we're each respectively needing to meet. And of course, we're attempting to do that jointly and then disaggregating that down into each of our individual LSEs so that we can kind of have a higher level understanding of what our impacts are before we go about meeting our needs. And of course, one of the key constraints you'll see there that always comes up is to be able to do this in an affordable manner. And certainly Energy Division, CPUC, is very keen, understandably, to make sure that we do it in a way that also doesn't create issues for the system as a whole. And particularly as we move forward to this universe with not just 3 IOUs, but many load-serving entities who are all participating in this process collectively, it becomes increasingly important for us to coordinate with each other. And so that's something that we're working on trying to do here. And the second objective, I think that we have here, so maybe is a bit of a philosophy in a way, is to bear in mind that each of our different objectives around reliability, around GHG emissions, and around cost, they're all very serious and important, and we're really making an effort to balance those in the process. And one of the things, too, that I think we're going to be trying to capture here both the trade-offs among them. And I think as we go forward into the new year and reconvene, we will hear more about what are the relative costs of being more aggressive or less aggressive. Also, how do different portfolios respond to uncertainty? We, as is often said, predictions are difficult to make, particularly about the future. And that's certainly true here, that we don't entirely know what conditions are going to look like, which makes it important to plan a portfolio that will perform relatively well under a wide range of potential future scenarios. And then one of the aspects of the modeling approach, of course, is that some of these objectives are better captured as constraints in the construction of the portfolio rather than as an output. And so we will take, for example, a lot of the, say, emission reduction targets and possibly like resource diversity issues as goals that we have that are set as constraints, and then the GHG targets and affordability may be an output that we then look at to say, is that acceptable or do we need to change something? And so those last pieces of like the outputs that we will be looking at to identify whether we are on the right track or not, those are going to be the measures that we're going to be looking to assess our portfolios, various portfolio options that we're going to develop through this process by the end of the day. And so this next slide, I think I will pass it off to Siemens to talk about, but it essentially is laying out in a little bit more detail the conceptual framework and the process framework around how we are developing the portfolio and assessing the portfolio in a manner that's fairly analogous to the way the Utility Commission is also going about it, the similar process for the statewide integrated resources plan. So I think I'll pass it off to Siemens to walk us through the details of this.
Yep. Okay, thank you very much, Doug. Yes, this is Charles from Siemens. So to touch on what Doug was referencing here is that we make use of two different softwares whenever we're doing projects. The first is Aurora XMP, which is developed by Energy Exemplar, formerly EPIS. And then the other is GPCM, which is developed by RBAC. To talk about the main one that we're using in this analysis is Aurora. GPCM is primarily used as a gas market modeling, and we use that for developing the gas prices that ultimately go into our Aurora model. There is an iterative approach that is taken between the two. The main thing that we're using is the Aurora model, and that is what's used to generate the long-term outlook for each of the CCAs, as well as the long-term outlook for California. There are a series of inputs as listed here, which are the fuel prices, the load, the emission prices, and the costs of new technologies. Those all are then inputted to generate both the power prices, the plant performance, and then the portfolios or the long-term portfolios for each of the CCAs. And then we can also, we take off the client information, and that is also inputted into the model to create the initial portfolio as well as the long term. And then on top of this, we're also doing these various states of the world, these scenarios, which will be used to help assess the risk and generate additional portfolios beyond the preferred and the compliance portfolios. And then finally, we'll be running this through our customized stochastic tool, which is built into the Aurora model, and that will help us to assess the risk associated with the portfolios that we create. There's the important need for least cost versus market exposure. So that's the high level. Are there questions at this point? Okay. Doug, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to this slide?
Yeah, a little bit. I wanted to emphasize, in particular, I think as you all are listening to this and thinking about it, one of the things that we're going to have to identify are those alternative scenarios and different portfolios to analyze. And so one of the things that I think it would be great to get feedback from the environmental community writ large is sort of what key scenarios or features or issues are on your mind that we maybe should be thinking about that, you know, from our perspective, maybe we aren't. You know, certainly we're going to be taking a look at the portfolios that would meet all of our respective local GHG targets and local energy targets and reliability targets, I think all of which are well in excess of the state standard. But I think we're also going to take a look at what happens when we are more aggressive with those goals. I think we are also potentially considering what happens under conditions of different rates of technology, either cost changes or availability. There may be scenarios around, say, different changes in load or, say, behind-the-meter storage adoption or EV adoption or, various other kind of future possibilities that we want to be aware of how those will affect the portfolios that we end up getting at the end of the day. So if there are particular key drivers of the sort of future world of the electrical grid, it would be great to hear kind of what you are thinking is likely to happen, or not even likely to happen, but what sorts of issues we think we should be addressing. And I think the other piece that I wanted to point out here is that, actually, those of you who aren't on, if you don't have a question, if you could mute yourself, that would be great.
Just a reminder that we are recording this and it will be posted to the CCA website following this meeting.
So for those who don't want to be memorialized with your what have you. The other piece of it too that I think that Siemens is also bringing to the table too that we're trying to incorporate, that I know a lot of us have talked about on our prior calls, is related to the other trends throughout the WEC and how various, like Washington State and Oregon State and Nevada and so forth, how the trends there around RPS requirements, I believe we're capturing those standards as well, and also the trajectories of coal plant retirements and so forth. So we are trying to model our effects within the context of California and that within the context of the WEC. And so there may be some issues that we or aspects of this that we end up modeling that may inform some of the questions that have arisen around resource availability and imports and so forth.
Are there any other questions or comments at this stage? I will say that we muted all participants to make sure that the line was quiet, so you would need to unmute yourself if you'd like to speak at this point.
Hey, this is Mark Specht with UCS. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Cool. I just wanted to comment on the gas modeling that you all are doing, which seems to me like a really good addition to this type of modeling. I'm just wondering to what extent you all are planning to explore different scenarios, scenarios where on the one hand, maybe we reach all our electrification goals in all sectors of the economy, and then maybe on the other hand, we don't reach our electrification goals, or we fall far short of them, and how those other sectors of the economy might impact what we're doing in the power sector, which seems to be built into this modeling through gas prices, I assume. So I don't know if you could comment on what kinds of sensitivities you're looking at on the gas side and how that might affect the results.
Hi, this is Charles again. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. So with the gas prices, we are varying those stochastically as part of the later analysis, and that is something that we can incorporate into the scenario. We can do that modeling in one of two ways. The first is if there's something that is affecting gas production separate from power generation, let's say regulations to hydraulic fracturing, increased external demand for liquefied natural gas. Those are all sorts of things that we can then run through GPCM to create alternative scenarios. And then the other one would be if we're expecting a substantially different USA-wide build-out. Obviously, there's not much increase in gas demand within the state of California beyond the immediate near term. So those would be the main drivers affecting the gas prices. Does that answer your question?
I guess that answers how you can do it, but I guess the question is, are any sensitivities being planned?
For like greater rates of electrification that would drive greater need for natural gas?
Well, greater rates of electrification that might reduce gas demand and maybe increase gas prices, that kind of dynamic.
I actually don't think we had we haven't fleshed that out yet, I think is the short answer, and that's, I think, probably a really good suggestion. It might be interesting to hear a little bit more about like what changes the idea what changes you're anticipating that we'd be modeling in that kind of sensitivity. So it's like if we had an increase in the rate of electrification, then that reduces the amount of demand for residential natural gas, I think is what you're thinking, but it also then increases the demand for electricity, which may or may not, depending on what the system mix is that's meeting that, may sort of have a different set of effects on gas prices. I certainly think that sounds like a likely candidate of the sorts of dynamics we try to capture. I don't know if the model actually gets the whole. Charles, this is a good question. I guess an interesting question for you. Does the model capture or model the changes in the demand for natural gas, both from the building side and from the energy generation side, and kind of dynamically model what should happen with natural gas prices as a result? I think the answer is not so much, right?
Well, so there's two aspects. There's the GPCM aspect, and then there's the Aurora aspect. So Aurora, no, gas is purely an inputted price, and the constraints there are only those that we manually impose. However, GPCM, that does look at all sides of all aspects of gas demand, not just power sector, but residential, commercial, and industrial. So hypothetically, you could have a sensitivity where we reduce the expected demand from those sectors in the state of California and maybe in some of the surrounding WEC territories and states which are also trying to go towards a cleaner grid or a cleaner state. And then that would probably have limited impact, I would say, on Henry Hub, which is the primary gas point, but it would have a larger impact on the surrounding gas hubs, such as SoCal Citygate, SoCal Border, PG&E, Malin, Suma, so on and so forth. And then those would then have lower prices if we assume, say, higher rates of electrification. And then, of course, assuming higher electrification would also assume higher load within the state of California and the surrounding states. So very much that sort of scenario would have two levers which we're pulling.
Thanks. I think that answers my question. I don't want to derail this presentation too much more, but I just want to point out that I think this is a pretty powerful pairing of these two models, with the gas model and the power model on the other side. And I think there's a lot of questions you could answer here that the PUC is not looking at. So I'm encouraged to see this.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I would view this as derailing, because I think one of the, I'm hoping the meat of this will be you all giving us ideas in terms of what it is we should be looking at and how we derive the most value out of the process. So, I appreciate that. I was kind of curious, what sorts of questions or concerns are you thinking about that sort of motivates the question, or that we should be looking at developing results around to inform the CPUC about?
I think I've heard other environmental groups express concern about the gas prices that are being used in the modeling. And the gas prices are obviously a function of to what extent we're electrifying other sectors of the economy. I think there are folks who have ideas that in the long term, even though we'll be using a lot less gas, we'll still have to pay for all the gas infrastructure, and so the gas prices they'll be going up, even though gas demand might be going down, just because you're paying fixed costs for infrastructure and using less actual gas. So maybe these questions are more interesting when you're going out to like 2045, when we're probably expecting to see much bigger changes in gas demand than we'll probably see going out to 2030. But that's where I'm coming from. Does that answer the question, Doug?
Yeah, it does, because I can see a scenario where we take a look at this, we keep track of what's happening to natural gas demand in the state, and that could be actually really important information. If our results end up being very sensitive to that, to be able to say to the Commission, we modeled it in this other way, both the volumes and the prices were allowed to vary, and this is what they did, and your model differs from that. Please be advised that this is an issue. And it may, that'll help us at least to get at least one data point about the magnitude, or the relative scale of that phenomenon, and get at least one picture of how much of an issue that's going to be going forward. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any other questions or clarifications at this stage?
If you want, I could just give a quick cover on what natural gas price forecast looks like. I'm not sure if the folks on the line have had a chance to see our PG&E and SoCal Citygate prices.
Charles, we did not release the slides in advance, so I don't think that they have.
Okay, I mean, I can just touch on it at a very high level. Right now, as you know, Henry Hub prices are fairly low, and there's a big price differential between the California gas bases and Henry Hub. Over time, we do have the gas prices growing up in terms of real dollars to about $3.90 by 2040. But we're also, and that's for Henry Hub. But we are seeing the difference between California and Henry Hub shrinking over time, so that there's, opposed from, you know, about the dollar difference now between Henry Hub and PG&E and SoCal, it's going closer to 25, 30 cents by 2040. And that decline is, it's pretty, it happens pretty quickly, and then it stays fairly flat over the long term.
Okay.
All right.
Great.
Just a reminder, if you do want to unmute your line, it is *6. Okay, we're going to transition then to Marie from East Bay.
Thanks, Melissa. You know, I think that the conversation we just had is a nice transition into what I'm about to talk about. With this slide, we really just wanted to set the stage for and set expectations and get everyone thinking about the very interrelated nature of some of the drivers and the outputs of the model. So, for example, fuel prices, which we were just discussing, and environmental policy both impact plant retirements. And plant retirements will impact fuel consumption, which leads to emissions. So it's this interrelated nature of drivers and outputs that are going to be very clearly or very much addressed in our modeling. That's one of our goals. In the next few slides, we'll be talking about some of the key inputs to the model. As Melissa and Doug have said a number of times, please ask a question at any time. But let's move forward to the next slide, and we'll talk about the actual load that we're using for our model, or for the Aurora model run. The joint CCA model is going to use the IPER forecast. If any of you are actually following the CEC's, the Energy Commission's IPER proceeding, you will know that the final IPER load forecast has not been released yet. We have received some draft numbers, and what we're going to use in the joint CCA model will be the year 2020 forecast for all four of our collective groups CCAs. The reason that we're using 2020 as opposed to 2019, for example, is that some of the CCAs, we're all pretty new, but some of us have not actually started serving load yet, or we have not taken on all of our load at this time. So in 2020, we'll actually, by using 2020 forecast data, we'll be able to more accurately model what we actually think each CCA's load will be in the years going forward. As for the reason that we're using the IPER forecast, it is the state standard for demand. It's comprehensive. It includes customer programs, not necessarily with the same assumptions and impacts that each of our respective CCAs assumes for those same programs or similar programs, but it does include some of the assumptions. And also, perhaps most importantly, the CPUC, the Public Utilities Commission, is requiring that we use the IPER forecast because it is, as I previously stated, it's the state's official load forecasting, or it's the state's official load forecast, and the CPUC wants to make sure that when aggregating all load-serving entities integrated resource plans, that they're able to do so in a way that is consistent and then disaggregate consistently as well. So a little bit of background about what is in the IPER forecast for our joint CCA parties. As I said, using all of our load in the year 2020, we collectively represent about 10.7% of statewide load. And that does include impacts based on impacts to our load forecasts based on energy efficiency, demand response, electric vehicle penetration, and behind-the-meter generation. Are there any questions about the IPER load forecast? Okay, moving forward. I think Siemens is going to discuss some of the details related to the other resource costs that will go into the model.
Okay. Yeah, this is Charles again. So we look at a variety of different technologies that are going to, both for the wider market and then for the CCAs themselves. The main ones that we perform in any analysis are natural gas technologies, solar and wind, as well as battery storage. So those are those costs we normally get from a variety of key different sources, normally ranging from the EIA's annual energy outlook, which normally provides a higher bound of costs. And then we have things such as the ZARD and Fluence, the IHS market reports. For renewables, we also get data from NRail and from Green Tech Media. And those all go in to sort of govern our assumptions. And then the highs and the lows come together to make an average forecast. Sometimes there is also client confidential information we can use to govern our targets. And then those upper and lower bounds are then used when developing our stochastic distributions, which we'll look at more in the next slide in a minute. But the main thing to note is that natural gas technologies are fairly mature. We're not really allowing for any combined cycle development in California, and there's very limited scope for any aeroderivative gas technologies to be built beyond the near term. The main things we're allowing for are solar, which obviously has continued falling levelized costs of entry, and then also wind, which has a lower decline curve than solar, but we are also modeling improvements in the capacity factor of wind, which is indicative of the larger wind turbines that are being developed, which are able to operate at lower wind speeds. Beyond that, we are also looking at lithium-ion energy storage. There's also been some interest in flow batteries, which is a newer but more expensive technology. And then the other core inputs are going to, beyond these technologies, the gas prices we discussed earlier, the load forecast, which Marie just discussed, is the carbon price and the coal prices. Coal obviously is not very important in California, but does impact the wider WEC market, and also as you know, there are some units which are contracts. And then there's the carbon price, both California's and then a USA-wide target. For your information, we are assuming that there will be some form of cap and trade policy adopted in 2025, and we do capture a wider range of potential carbon prices using our stochastic analysis, including the possibility that the USA may never adopt a nationwide carbon program. Are there any questions at this time? Okay. No.
Yeah. One interesting note there, I think, to draw a little bit of attention to that we talked about is the role of coal here. I will be interested to see how things shake out, but I do think that the combination between the activities that we're planning on doing and then, of course, the RPS standards that are coming online and no-goal policies, say, coming in Oregon, and I think Oregon and Washington both have that now, will be to get a handle on to what extent our activities are mirrored elsewhere. And if there are dynamics where, for example, we end up choosing a lot of Pacific Northwest hydro, that will give us some, Charles, correct me if I'm wrong, but it'll give us at least some insight into whether there either is or is not then some like big spike in coal, which under resource shuffling arguments, that's sort of long been, I think, theoretically this could happen, but I will be curious to see what sort of indications we have about what's going on across the West as, we're moving forward and other states are also moving forward.
Yeah, I can speak to coal is that if I was to rank the most relevant input assumptions to power prices and portfolios, it's load, then natural gas prices, and then it normally becomes a toss-up between coal and carbon prices, because coal is generally speaking a baseload technology, and since none of the states right now outside of California are placing a cost on emissions, the effect is that coal is very seldomly the price setter, rather it's just a price taker. You still normally have natural gas setting the margin. If you have a high enough national CO2 price, though, that can start to flip, but then that's also when coal units tend to start to retire since they're not fast ramping resources.
So we did have a question on the line, and you have been unmuted, Mohit.
Mohit, are you there? Again, thanks for joining us. That's great.
Yeah. So I wanted to understand how the costs compare with the California Public Utilities Commission cost assumptions.
Which cost in particular?
So they have a set of cost assumptions for all these technologies as well, right? And I know it's a broad question, but I was wondering if you looked to see how the cost of new build-outs for solar and wind or whatever you have compare with theirs.
I do not have those numbers in front of me at this time, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. And then these are costs for new build-outs, right?
Yes.
Okay. So you don't actually model what the actual prices you pay on a contract, you model the cost to build new resources.
Yes, that's correct. Unless it's a specified contract provided, information provided by one of the CCAs.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, and Mohit, as a follow-up, I think actually, at least for some, maybe for all of the portfolios we develop, but the conforming portfolios are going to, I believe, are required to use the CPUC cost assumption numbers. So we'll at least have some runs that are perfectly aligned with those because Energy Division wants that.
Yeah, and I was also more interested in understanding if you have improvements on some of those assumptions that you could provide them. But yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, right. So if we take a look at those and say, that's interesting, but that's not what we're seeing and not what others are seeing as those assumptions. Yeah, I think we could certainly provide some insight on that going forward. That's a good call.
So this is Tyson with Protect Our Communities. I was curious about three of the assumptions on the screen here: the solar, the wind, and the energy storage. All of those are showing as declining in cost, and various expert predictions have been made by the various sources that you listed as being inputs here, and for the most part, everyone has been a little bit too pessimistic about the energy storage decline in cost, as well as, to a certain extent, solar and wind over the years. Can you talk a little bit about how close your predictions have been using the inputs that you've used, and what you expect the what you expect here versus, and this covers a little bit what was just said, what you expect here versus what the Commission is taking a look at in terms of costs.
Yes, this is Charles again. So I can talk that certainly in the past with regards to renewables and storage, we have taken a bit more of a conservative approach, especially if it depends on how heavily you weight and utilize the various sources. As I mentioned, AEO tends to be a couple of years behind the curve. With the introduction of some of the newer forecasts, especially green tech media, we've definitely come down more, especially in regards to our starting numbers. That said, I think the main benefit we have is that our stochastics are able to capture a range of different new build costs, and that gives a better sense of the costs associated with these new technologies. And I don't know if you want to go to the next slide just to show what those look like. Yeah.
Let me, this is Jerry Cawley with Siemens as well. Let me add, I think that's a good suggestion for one of the additional scenarios that we would look at would be an aggressive cost scenario for renewables and storage, and look at that alternative view as well. We're doing the best forecast we believe will happen, but I think in addition to the gas scenario suggested earlier, an aggressive pricing scenario in renewables and storage would be a good suggestion as well.
Yeah, there's one more thing to note on this is that obviously California has its RPS targets, and we always assume that the state will meet those targets irrespective of the scenario of sensitivity. So a lot of what's governing the costs have less bearing on the state of California than they do in, say, the wider WEC market, where these costs are more relevant. But of course, the costs are obviously also relevant for the CCAs here, since that determines how much it looks like it's going to cost their customers.
Thanks, I appreciate the insight.
That's great. Thank you, Tyson, for pointing that out, and keep it coming. So, I guess moving on to the cost assumptions and the stochastic piece there. Charles, do you want to speak to that next bit?
Yeah, certainly. So this is just touching on it again, to briefly touch on it. We use the highs and the lows of the individual sources we use for our forecast to determine the highs and lows of our stochastic distributions. We then perform an analysis which generates 2,000 iterations of separate capital costs, and we do this for all of the other input assumptions as well, gas, carbon, that sort of thing. And then that governs the distributions of those 2,200 iterations are then randomly selected, and those then become the basis of our stochastic analysis, and that shows here. It is important to note that these lines here representing the different distributions are not indicative of any one iteration, but rather the value in that given year.
This is Gary Vicinas. One of the things that I would point out is that if you look at these graphs, the uncertainty in solar PV costs are wider than they are for more conventional technologies. So you'll see not only will it decline more in the base case, which are the dotted lines, but you'll also see that the distributions are wider depending upon, and it reflects the fact that the uncertainty is greater. As you pointed out, a lot of people have missed the decline in solar costs, for example, and to some degree the battery cost declines in the last couple of years. But there's also uncertainty as to when the technology becomes more mature and where it will level out. So
you will see that on the upper end, for example, on the solar PV costs, there is some possibility that while capital costs have come down a lot, they will start to level off and become more mature. But then on the more aggressive sides on the low end, it's much steeper and declines over the entire period. So we try and capture that in the risk analysis, whereas you won't see that level of uncertainty in some of the conventional technologies that have been more mature over time. Same thing with lithium-ion battery systems. It's more similar to the solar PV in terms of the rapid decline that we're starting to see in those costs and those extending over a period of time. So there's two ways to handle this, as Jerry pointed out. One is that you can look at scenarios of greater technology increases to sort of see how that affects the optimal portfolio or the least cost portfolio of assets that you might want to select. And then you can test that portfolio against the base case portfolio and run them through these 200 iterations that we would run to make sure that you determine how well they perform across a wide range of outcomes.
Any additional questions or comments at this stage? Okay.
The last area we wanted to discuss is resource availability assumptions. So we've talked about the cost, we've talked about load, but I think Charles mentioned that in terms of resource availability, the Siemens model is not modeling any substantial development of natural gas resources, but other obvious areas or other resource types that are of particular interest to California load-serving entities. One is hydro imports coming in from the Pacific Northwest. The graph to the right demonstrates that there's been some variety of import quantities from hydro resources in the Pacific Northwest into California over the last, well, from the 2013 to 2016 time frame. The model that we'll be running is going to assume about 13 terawatt hours of imports. And the reason behind that is that it's a close to average but appropriately conservative estimate given uncertainty around actual hydro supply, impacts of climate change, the fact that Pacific Northwest load-serving entities are trying to reduce their own carbon emissions as well. So there are sort of a variety of factors that go into the 13 terawatt hour estimate. We're also expecting, or we're also modeling limitations to the potential for onshore wind development, and it's reflecting increased stringency or increased ordinances in numerous California counties, LA, San Bernardino, San Diego, also up here in Alameda County. The ability for wind farms to get bird take permits has become much more limited in recent months. And then the fact that there are federal lands restrictions that limit the ability to build or to develop wind farms on those federal lands. I believe 80% of federal lands are considered off limits to wind farms. This is the last area that we were anticipating discussing with you today. So if I would like to open it up to the group to ask any questions about the resource availability assumptions. If you have questions about the model itself, we can go back and look at previous slides. And we're really open at this point to accepting any questions, concerns, or feedback that you might have.
Yeah, and actually, I realized too, as a little additional note there, Stephanie did want to let you know we did pass power of place study on to Charles, and I think we may, I'm not sure if we've really advanced very far in terms of taking a look at sort of the impacts of greater like regulatory and other sort of biologically preferred areas, kind of using the screens that you all had, but that certainly might be something that we can take a look at doing there. And we are looking at that, at your study, trying to figure out how to work with that piece of it.
That's great. Thanks for letting me know. Who's that speaking? Is that Doug?
Yeah, it's Doug.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for letting me know. And also, feel free to reach out if you have any questions or want to discuss anything in there further, like the data resources used and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, Charles, this is Stephanie from the Nature Conservancy, who was involved in the study that I sent to you. So.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, give that a read over. So, no, it was good to know, although it is somewhat, I was a bit worried when I read in sort of the uncertainties that if all the surrounding states started to adopt California target, then we might have to reassess that. Because it looks like some are definitely going that way.
Exactly, and that's one of the questions we've been pursuing, too, opportunities for future investigations into that question. So, yeah, more work to be done there.
Yeah, I will just touch on very briefly and let you know that we are making the assumptions that Washington, Nevada, and New Mexico are also going towards their carbon-free target.
Yeah, okay, that's good to know. You said Washington, Oregon, Nevada?
And New Mexico.
And New Mexico, okay.
So this is Tyson again. When you're taking a look at the various states across the WEC that are increasing their renewable energy requirements and how that's going to affect California, do you see the same sorts of concerns that the Public Utilities Commission has expressed in the recent IRPs, as for instance, the RA procurement that they just issued a decision on?
It's, how do I put this? It's something we're keeping on the radar, but it's not something we've caught as much concern as, I think. But I think also part of that stems from, one, we intentionally ensure that there's enough RA resources to prevent any severe price spikes that you could expect it, that those may be part of the stochastics, but they wouldn't necessarily be part of our deterministic outlook. The other thing is, of course, our analysis is going out to 2040. So even though we're showing all of those states going towards those targets, 2045 is obviously the year when most of those goals are achieved, except Nevada, which is 2050.
Got it. In terms of the IRP, the IPER, when you're taking a look at that, do you have, and I realize that it was covered that you're required to use those assumptions. I assume, though, that when you're taking a look at those assumptions, you're also using your own assumptions to inform what would be most reasonable to make sure that the CCAs are best protected from large increases in load, decreases in load, et cetera. One of the loads that seems like it is going to be just incredibly difficult to predict over the next decade is the increase in the use of electric vehicles, and especially if it turns out that one of these big companies figures out how to do self-driving vehicles. It seems like the uptick in the number of EVs on the road at that point would just be incredible over a very, very short period of time. Have you taken a look at that, and how would you be approaching that with modeling?
Yep, so we're primarily relying upon the IPER forecast, but we've also done our own internal analysis this year, updating our electric vehicle forecast, and that's primarily looking at sales information, registration, and then also looking at the average life of these electric vehicles. There's also a matter of, how quickly they can be produced. I can't say that we've been looking into how demand might be affected by self-driving cars. That seems somewhat separate because that sort of technology is not exclusive to electric vehicles. But I can say that it is also a factor ultimately in our load stochastics. So those iterations there can be indicative of that.
Okay.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Okay. Doug Carpenter. On both of those, so on the first point about reliability and RA issues, I mean, we are going to be taking a look at some of our own. We are going to be taking a look at some reliability metrics, loss of load expectations, and possibly like planning reserve margin issues to make. It's a key consideration to make sure that we're not having adverse reliability impacts. So that's may or may not be taking exactly the same form as system RA, which is an ongoing conversation, I think, statewide. And on the EV piece, I do think, one of the alternative scenarios that we're thinking about looking at is exactly that. What does it look like if there is really a massive explosion of both electrification and EV adoption, particularly because we're actively working to make that happen. So I think that's likely to be one of the scenarios that we end up looking at.
Hey, Doug, just as a follow-up, this is Mohit again with NRDC. A suggestion would be to model just a high electrification scenario that models high levels of electrification in transportation and buildings in line with the estimates that E3 has done that we would need to get to our 2045 carbon neutrality goals.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. That's not a bad sort of trajectory, source of a trajectory of like, well, how aggressive should we model? I will point out that given the time frame, there's a limited number of alternate scenarios that we're going to be able to do.
Right.
So it may be the sort of thing that, if we've got, if we can run, say, 4 different scenarios, and one of those I think is probably going to be focused on more aggressive GHG reductions, and we've got another 3 to look at things like increased electrification and transportation electrification. Those are likely to get lumped into a single scenario, and then we can take a look maybe at the natural gas question. And then
right. That was my suggestion, was to lump them into a single scenario so you get a bookend of high electrification amounts, and hopefully the inputs, some of them are ready-made for you by the work that E3 is done with the PUC. And there's one question, was that, are you looking at offshore wind as a possible resource?
We are looking at offshore wind as a resource. However, it has to be the newer floating offshore wind as opposed to the fixed turbines that you have on the East Coast. Just one thing regarding electric vehicles. Our forecast currently starts with a number around 500,000 electric vehicles in the state of California. And by 2040, we have that growing to a little under 7 million. Given that I think right now California has about 15 million registered automobiles in the state, so we're looking at about 50%. So there's definitely the prospect that you could have a more aggressive case where, say, California mandates that by 2045 all cars be electric vehicles. And I agree that this is one of those areas which is very open for a state of the world, or a sensitivity, I should say.
Yeah, I think that.
If you have that E3 study, if you want to shoot that my way, that would be nice. Or we have it already. Since we have some E3 people work for us now.
I think the EVs is really interesting in that we're rapidly seeing places like the EU requiring efficiencies that essentially eliminate the possibility of sales of gasoline vehicles by, say, 2030, which is a very short time frame. And if we saw California do the same sort of thing, then it might be it might be considerably higher than even the high-end estimate of what you're taking a look at. But I'm with you. It's very difficult to figure out where that's going to be.
Yeah, there is the law of unintended consequences with a mandate like that, though, speaking as a European, because of course it means that some people who can't afford to buy electric vehicles just end up holding on to older and dirtier fossil vehicles longer.
Sure.
Hey, this is Mark with UCS. I was hoping to ask a follow-up on the reliability stuff. Someone mentioned that you'd be calculating loss of load metrics. And I'm wondering, would that be the personal loss of load metrics for this 4 CCAs doing this modeling? Or does this modeling include optimization of all the resources in the CAISO for all of the LSEs in the CAISO? I guess I'm wondering what the scope of the modeling is and what you're focusing on in the results.
So I can speak a little bit to the modeling approach. What we have is we have what's called our national reference case, which uses the assumptions which we provided to the CCAs, and this governed the build-out of the wider California market, and we're also vetting that against the CPUC to make sure that build-out can be held in compliance of the compliance portfolio. What's then done is those power prices help to govern what the build-out is for the individual CCAs, as well as all the other inputs around their costs, but getting a sense of market purchases and reliability. And we make sure that our reference case doesn't have any severe price spikes that we couldn't defend as part of a weather normalized model. With the individual CCAs, though, there is some element of making sure that they have sufficient resources, especially, I won't necessarily speak to which ones, but some of the CCAs have hourly constraints and they want all of their load at all times to be met by renewable resources. And so what's important there is that we make sure that our build-out does not, that our build-out meets that requirement. And if it doesn't, then we have to discuss it with the CCA themselves.
So there is some sort of larger optimization of all the California build-out happening in the modeling, and then it's focusing down on this 4 CCAs in this study. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and some of what we end up looking at probably will be informed also by how Energy Division lands on its filing requirements and the kind of the narratives they have around how they're going to be assessing individual LSE impacts on statewide reliability. And it sounds like we'll have more information by the end of the month on that.
This is Tyson with Protect Our Communities again. I was curious about how the work on batteries is going to be viewed in the modeling. With batteries, there are a whole variety of different revenue streams, and only some of them are available in California at the current time. But that means that in the future, we could see changes to where we're going to have more revenue streams available for batteries. We also, you talked in the presentation about the cost of batteries coming down. And then the other aspect is that with batteries for reliability, you end up with having a resource that can serve a purpose every day throughout the course of the year, as opposed to gas power plants that can really only just sit there and wait to be turned on. With all of those different opportunities, is the model able to capture those? How are you taking a look? And then how are you taking a look at the possible additional revenue streams that the batteries may have in the future?
Charles, would you like me to take that? This is Gary.
If you want to, Gary, I'm happy to.
Yeah, that's a very complex question that you asked, and it involves a lot of different potential value streams. Some are on the reliability side and can be done at the transmission distribution level. Others are more at the generation level. In an IRP, traditionally, we focus on the generation-related value streams associated with the batteries. And we will be looking at like flow batteries and additional technologies that can extend the time frame between charging and discharging and things like that. We can include that in the model. There are also intra-hour issues associated with storage, and in the current modeling that we are doing, we won't be looking at intra-hour modeling. So we're making some general assumptions around focusing on the generation-related values as opposed to all the values that you're talking about. We're not focusing in this study on some of the transmission and distribution value and the value stacking that could be required. Those are potential options, but in the time frame that we have and the scope that we have, we're really looking at the generation-focused storage value, and we're looking at it on an hourly basis. Charles, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, it was a very accurate and succinct summary, Gary. Thank you.
Can I just, this is Marie from East Bay. Can I just add that each of the CCAs may have slightly different goals associated with the outcome of the IRP. Some of us want to look at how to reduce GHG emissions faster than others. Some of us may want to find a path towards 100% renewable generation faster than others. So, but we all share the goals of GHG emissions reduction. We all share the goals of doing it in the most cost-effective way and meeting our respective communities' goals and their values. So we're doing the IRP from that perspective, and not so much from a how to maximize. And so there is an economic element of that, certainly, but we're not looking at specifically how to maximize the value of individual resource types.
Yeah, I appreciate the thought there. I think that, you know, of course, maximizing individual resource types doesn't make sense. You want to, you know, I think is what you were pointing out. You want to maximize the value of the overall system and minimize GHG emissions. So I'm on board. I understand the goal is not necessarily one resource or another.
Thank you for the question.
Any other questions or comments at this stage? Well, I can say that I think this has been a really productive conversation from our perspective. We really appreciate you being here and, you know, giving this your thoughtful consideration. If you have additional thoughts or questions as they come up, please feel free to reach out to us. I think you all have Doug's email from the meeting invite, so that might be the simplest way to channel your questions to our group. But we'd certainly love to continue to get your input as we go through this process. It's the first time that anybody's tried doing a joint IRP like this, so we're all kind of learning together, but we think it's an exciting opportunity for us to hopefully collectively achieve some of the goals that we're all trying to individually meet a little bit more efficiently and effectively. We also would like to invite you to engage with us in the future as well. We're hoping to have another meeting like this in this winter to start discussing some of the preliminary results from some of our modeling efforts, and would of course be wonderful if you and your colleagues could attend at that point as well. If there are any final questions, we'll take them now. Otherwise, we'll wrap up here. Okay, well, thank you so much, and we hope everybody has a happy holiday, and we look forward to engaging in the new year.
Yeah, really appreciate everyone coming to this, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Thanks
a million.
Bye.